Chapter 1. I Spit in the Curve of the Wind. "Oh, she ain't any water rat, ma'am. She's a girl flower, she is, with the tropic heavens for a hothouse, and the scolding of the storm for her when she's bad. And she knows all that we sailormen know, all the good, 'cause no one of us ever let her hear nothing else." It was old John Henry, one of our sailors, defending me to the wife of an American consul in an Australian port. She had asked him, as he stood on watch on the gangway, what kind of water rat was the captain's daughter, living such a rough life among rough men on a schooner. And John Henry, feeling he must uphold the dignity of the captain's daughter and the genteelness of sailormen, had replied with all the sea poetry he could command. "But how awful for a girl to be raised on a ship with nothing but men!" persisted the woman, unconvinced. She hadn't seen me, but she heard the talk of the waterfront, and she knew I must be rough and coarse and low. Just awful, raised without the softening feminine influence. "Awful, hell!" snorted John Henry. "Oh, she ain't no damn fool like most women. Her old man uses a rope's end on her stern often enough to keep the foolishness out in her head." I was taking it easy, rolled up in the canvas of the mizzen sail which was furled on the mizzen boom. If I hadn't been afraid of women, I would have come down to see how different she was from me, because I couldn't understand why anyone should think it strange that I lived on a ship with no woman to care for me. Hadn't she gone to sea when she was a little girl? I supposed every girl went to sea when she was young, for I knew nothing but the sea and strange island ports. The smell of rotting copra, putrid pearl oysters drying, sandalwood in little bundles piled high on our deck, the fumes from a cargo of guano, and sacks of ivory nuts. These things, the places they came from, and the people who brought them to us, were the commonplaces of my life. The legends of the sea told me by the sailors on our ship were my fairy tales. The freak storms, the bewildering doldrums in the tropics, and the companionship of old shellback sailors the foundation of my experience. My father's ship, the Minnie A. Kane, was a four-masted windjammer-rigged schooner, engaged in the copra and sandalwood trade between the islands of the South Seas and Australia. I couldn't remember when I wasn't on a ship. Born in Berkeley, California, known in the maritime world as the sea captain's bedroom, I was the 11th child in our family. 4 of my brothers and sisters had died in 2 years. They called me the lick of the pan because I was last and not much of me. No one expected me to grow up, but father said, "This is the last one, and I'm going to save it. I'll take it away from the land and let the sea make it pick of the puppies." So he took me when I was less than a year old, and I lived on shipboard until I was 17. And if the sea didn't make me the pick of the puppies, at least it made me the huskiest. Father brought me up with no creed except fear and respect for the gods that brew the storms and calms. As to God himself, I can say only that in my early life he and I were on the most intimate terms. I had not half the fear of him that I had of father. I felt much closer to him because I could discuss many things with him that I wouldn't have dared mention to father. He was my friend, confidant, and counselor, and I always felt that he approved of everything I did, and if I felt he disapproved, I would argue until I convinced him, in my own mind. Our arguments and discussions took place at the masthead far above the deck, where no one could hear our private conversations. Many a time I climbed to the cross-trees of the foremast and had it out with him. If things had gone well with me, I thanked him. As for instance, if I had managed to steal an extra hunk of brown sugar from the storeroom for my oatmeal, without being caught, I thought he was a good sport and told him so. But I gave him hell if he let us get caught in a sudden storm that ripped our sails, or if we were becalmed in the deadly doldrums. Father was very different. Much more concrete, harder to twist around my finger, more to be feared than God, in my estimation. I could say anything to God, praise him, gossip with him, or tell him to go to the devil, and I did. But in all my years on the ship I heard few ever tell father to go to the devil, and none ever did it twice. It was from my father that I inherited my love of the sea, the understanding of it, and the courage to face it. The sea was his life, and he never wanted any other. How could a boy born on an old clipper lying in far-off Geelong Bay, Australia, expect to do anything but follow the sea? And if the wanderlust ruled his blood, certainly he came by it naturally. My grandfather, Louis Lazaverich, was a Montenegrin landowner, and my grandmother a beautiful girl of Turkish blood, whom Louis Lazaverich had married in spite of the Montenegrin hatred of the Turks. Life in Montenegro with a Turkish wife was not so pleasant. Consequently, after the birth of their first child, the young couple, to get away, planned a trip around the world in a sailing ship. In Geelong Bay, Australia, where the ship had put in, my father was born. My grandmother was so ill that her husband took her ashore and told the captain of the clipper ship that they would stay in Australia, and he could pick them up on his return voyage in 2 years. Within a week of the time of their landing, my grandfather was accidentally drowned in Geelong Bay. Had left my grandmother stranded with 2 children, my father and his older sister. Shortly after my grandfather's death, my grandmother met a fascinating German pearl trader, Captain Wagner. Beautiful women were scarce in Australia in those days, and there has always been a certain affinity between beautiful women and pearls. Moreover, Turkish women are fatalistic, so it was not long before the pearl trader married my grandmother, but once married he absolutely refused to have his honeymoon cluttered up with his predecessor's children. As to my grandmother, new love and the pearls outweighed old love in her children, and as I have said before, Turkish women are fatalistic. So she and her pearl trader sailed away to the South Seas, and the good Jesuit fathers took in the unwanted children. For the first 10 years of his life, my father endured the confinement, the strict discipline, and the soul loneliness of the Jesuit orphan asylum, and then the wanderlust in his blood took hold. Fearing the good fathers might not understand, and not wishing to hurt their feelings by telling him what he thought of their orphanage, he departed quietly one night without saying good-bye. A few days later, when he left Australia on a trading schooner plying between Melbourne and China, that same modesty and diffidence kept him from letting the captain of the crew know he was on board until, when they were out at sea, hunger forced his confession. They whipped him and put him to work, but they couldn't turn back or stop the ship on his account, so he got to China. Then followed 8 years' work on the traders in the Far East before the boy, now 18, sailed into San Francisco Bay, deckhand on a full-rigged English clipper. San Francisco at that time was only a sheltered harbor with a dock about a block long. One day a young girl wandered down to the wharf to watch the ships come in. On the clipper ship she saw a handsome dark-haired young man holstoning the deck. He spoke to her. She had never seen anyone like him before. He told her stories of the sea, stories of trading and escapes from sea thieves off the China coasts. She was so fascinated by his tales that she stole away every day to meet him. The girl was Emmeline Trask Lowell, the 14-year-old daughter of Dr. Butler Lowell, once of Boston, but then of the more liberal-minded San Francisco. The Lowells were a very respectable family in Massachusetts. Young Dr. Butler Lowell had relatives enough to keep any young doctor comfortably occupied. He was a cousin, though twice removed, of James Russell Lowell. But when he began to preach that consumption was catching, and people with dry cough should be put off by themselves, all the sisters and all the cousins and the aunts turned against him. I guess there were too many in Massachusetts in that day rather proud of their dry cough as an added subject of conversation. When the neighbors turned against a doctor, there was only one thing for the doctor to do, and Dr. Butler Lowell did it. His move landed him in San Francisco. Although Dr. Lowell had radical medical ideas, his other notions were quite in accord with his family tradition, which perhaps was the reason that Emmeline Lowell didn't tell her parents of the deckhand she had fallen in love with. Instead, she eloped with her sailor to Niles, California. They kept their marriage a secret, and a month later my father sailed for Samoa, to be gone for a year. When he returned, he found a baby son, my oldest brother. My mother hated the sea. It took my father away from her sometimes for months, sometimes for 2 or 3 years. She never went with him, for the babies came along too fast. I was the 11th. Over a period of years, Father worked himself up until he was the ranking captain of the Alaska Packers fleet of salmon ships. During the months his ship was frozen in Alaska, he learned the North like a book. He made charts of the wilds around Nome for the government. He prospected for gold. He went whaling for oil and sealing for rich furs. He traded with the Eskimos, giving them tools, lumbers, and firearms in exchange for rare carved ivory tusks of walrus and polar bear skins. I've always thought of Father as the swordfish of the ship. I began thinking of him that way the day I saw a swordfish and a whale in deadly combat. Because of its size and the pictures they have seen of small boats being smashed by one sweep of its tail, most people naturally think of the whale as king of the ocean, but that impression is wrong. The swordfish is the boss. Both the whale and the shark are too slow and too clumsy to whip the real ruler of the sea. The swordfish doesn't grow beyond 15 feet, but it fights because it likes to fight, and on occasion has driven its weapon 10 inches through the copper and oak side of a ship. We were in the trade winds about 10 degrees north of the equator one hot afternoon, when, close to the ship and entirely without warning, a sperm whale leaped frantically clear, and while in the air smacked down at the water savagely with its tail. The yell of the man at the wheel and the noise of that resounding slap brought all hands to the rail. "Swordfish," said Father. "Nothing else ever made a whale jump out of the water." 3 times that whale jumped out, and what a thrashing about there was. The battle was ahead of us and a little to one side, but neither fighter paid the slightest attention to the ship. The swordfish would come up from under to thrust at the tender underside of the whale. Then the whale would leap and come down lashing with its huge tail, with terrific force to kill its attacker, but always in vain. In a few minutes the commotion quieted. The water was bloody. There was no whale in sight. Father wasn't a large man, and every once and so often some whale of a sailor, deceived by his size, would undertake to defy him with force. Then followed the battle, and Father always emerged the swordfish of the ship. Every time he won a battle his crew seemed prouder of him, and he became kinder than before. Just because I was the only girl on board, I was not accorded any privileges that sailors didn't get. I went without food as they did when we were on a long trip and the provisions ran short. I stood my trick at the wheel and steering, pulled at the ropes when we were tacked, manned the pumps when the ship sprang a leak, said yes, sir, to my father, and was taught to obey as a sailor obeys the master of the ship. Above all, I was taught the code of the sea. Never squeal on anyone, take punishment without a squawk, and be ashamed to show fear. I had no other children to play with, no other woman thing on board, so my playthings were seabirds, little toy ships, and a lifeboat which was made fast to the deck and was seldom used. I would get in that lifeboat and pretend to row. I measured my strokes and counted 1,000 strokes to the mile. In my lifeboat, strapped to the deck, I used to row away on long picnic trips by myself, to places where I would find children to play with, children like I had seen playing around the docks in port. And what games we had! The games played with those imaginary children always involved something to eat. You see, on a sailing ship bound on a voyage of 120 days, the food is rationed so many ounces per person per day. Because I was little, my rations rated 1/2 of a grown sailor's share. That was probably an excellent thing for my health, but there was never a day when I couldn't have eaten 4 times as much. So food and playmates were my dreams of unattainable bliss. At my picnics we would set tables with piles of wonderful foods, and I would eat all the things I wanted to. The only food I knew about was rough ship food, such as lentils, rice, salt beef and brine, dried fish and dried fruits. The sailors told me about delicious victuals that people on land had for every meal. Fresh juicy apples and cakes, and chicken stuffed with raisins and lots of sugar and real milk. Of course, I thought the sailors just made up those things, so I pretended I really had them on my dream voyages. The children, and there were always thousands of them, would play with me. I had long conversations with them about pretty dresses and mothers, and living in one house for a long time and waking up in the same place every day. I had these conversations out loud, but no one ever paid any attention to me, because the crew and father were too busy all the time to notice what I did. When my games were over, I pretended the children were sorry to have me leave, and I would promise to row back the next day and play with them again. But no matter where I went or how far, I had to count my strokes carefully, because if I made a mistake, how could I ever get back to the ship? When my picnic was finished, I'd climb back into the lifeboat and began carefully counting my strokes for the return voyage, until I had reached the proper number and knew it was safe to disembark from my stationary lifeboat to the deck of our schooner, once more just to see Captain's daughter. Our trips usually took from 80 to 120 days at sea without sighting land. Through storms, calms, waterless days, when our water casks ran dry, scurvy and headwinds, we travelled from port to port. If I ever felt fear, I knew better than to express it. My father and the sailors had taught me a faith that made me hold on no matter what happened. They believed there was God in the sunsets, in the storms, in the whiteness of an albatross's wing, and in the wind that blew our ship along. Life at sea did not seem any mystery. An old sailor taught me that thunder was the growling curse of a dead sea captain who had lost his course. The blinding flashes of lightning were the combined sparkles of barmaids' eyes luring seamen to a pleasant harbor. The groaning, creaking noises in the rigging and the hull of the ship, which seemed so much louder at night, were the tired squawkings of our schooner, her complaints at carrying such heavy cargoes. That is what I believed, but sometimes I knew that those noises were really seams that had opened under the stress of the pounding sea, that water was leaking into the hold as fast as the crew could pump it out, and the straining noises in the rigging told of weather-rotting blocks that might carry away at any moment. Every night before I turned into my bunk, I realized I might be going to sleep for the last time. There were so many dangers begetting a sailing ship on the deep seas, that every sailorman knows the end may come at any moment. Yet in spite of that ghost which stalked the decks at night, I would fall asleep unafraid. Our sailors were the huskiest men father could assemble. Swedes, Norwegians, Germans, Irishmen, and Poles. What they lacked in brains they more than made up for in brawn. Natural-born rovers, they were content as long as we sailed, but when we hit port they floundered hopelessly in waterfront saloons, or on the islands where they went ashore, and the native girls, thrilled by their physiques and white skins, gave themselves freely. The native girls were fascinated by the white-skinned men off the ships that sailed to their islands from the lands beyond the horizon, and the sailors were more than willing to be adored gods to the little bronze beauties who caressed them and covered them with flowers. The fact that some day the question of sex would be an issue for me to face never occurred to me, for I had my whole world of people catalogued from my one-sided perspective on sailors. Mates were usually married to some faithful woman in the old country, Sweden. Captains, in my opinion, never drank or made love to women because they loved some woman in the States as my father loved their mother. Cabin boys represented to me pimply youths just out of high school, who ran away to sea for adventure and didn't find it, or dreamy boys who were too lazy to work ashore. Cooks, because we had Japanese cooks, were heavenly people who would give me extra food. As an antidote for unsavory influences such as perfume, which I smelled on the cook, and dreams of living in cities, father made me take a salt-water bath in a canvas tank on deck every day. Only when it rained did I get a fresh-water bath. There was no seaman's work that my father or the sailors didn't teach me. I learned arithmetic by adding up tide tables in navigation books. Before I was 12, I could take the sight of the sun and figure out our position on the chart. I learned to read intelligent things, as I termed them, from an old battered set of encyclopedia. We had a complete set except for the volumes from N to S, which had been destroyed when necessity forced the mates and father to use their pages for certain hygienic purposes. As a result, I had read everything in those encyclopedias except the subjects contained in the missing volumes. Our ship's library, supplied by those well-meaning societies ashore that feel seamen need fine literature to uplift them, consisted of such books as the care and feeding of pedigree dogs, modern science of surgery, engineering, hymn books, Caesar's Conquest, in Latin, and other such works guaranteed to inspire the minds of sailors to loftier ideals than the fleshpots. In desperation for something to read at sea, the sailors would borrow the books, read them from cover to cover, and return them to the library feeling rich in the priceless knowledge they imparted. Even I read them all, and father highly approved, because he said they wouldn't fill my head full of silly notions. Once a sailor fell so low as to bring a sixpenny paper-covered novel on board entitled Mad Love. The sailors all read it, and I managed to get it by standing its owner's tricks at the wheel for 2 whole days. If it wasn't elevating, at least Mad Love appealed to me more than the care and feeding of pedigree dogs. Some day when I'm rich, I'm going to supply all the sailing ships in the world with real storybooks to avenge those years of barren reading which were foisted upon us by the uplift societies. One of the chief accomplishments of our sailors was their spitting. They chewed tobacco and spat the juice freely. They could spit at a crack and hit it without a miss, and one sublimely endowed sailor could spit a curve to windward without a mishap. I tried chewing tobacco, but the first time I chawed a hunk, father told me to swallow the juice if I wanted to be a good spitter. Obediently, I swallowed a whole mouthful of bitter tobacco juice. The result was as expected. After that lesson, I chawed dried prunes which made grand spit. After long weeks of practice, I could not only spit at a crack, but I could hit it, and it is on record that I spit 2 curves on a windy day, which gave me a high rating as an able-bodied seaman. When that woman was disapproving of me to John Henry because I lived on a ship, a man-raised child, I wondered if she could even spit straight herself, and if she couldn't, what did she know about our sea anyhow?